record something for the Women in Gender Studies program in a while, so don't trip over the tripod. All right, my name is Paisley Curra, and I'm the Internal Endowed Chair of Women's Studies and Women in Gender Studies, and I'm also a professor of political science. And I am delighted to welcome Dr. Claudia Sofia Garriga Lopez today to Brooklyn College in our Transfeminism series. Dr. Garriga Lopez is an assistant professor of queer and trans Latinx studies in the Department of Multicultural and Gender Studies at the California State University, Chico. Her scholarly work is grounded in a critical engagement with activism, public policy, and public health, as well as trans, feminist, and queer performance art and cultural production in Latin America, the Caribbean, and within people of color communities in the United States. So I can say that Dr. Garriga Lopez is among an exciting new generation of researchers who are moving transgender studies out of its comfort zone. Trans studies in its first iterations tended to privilege theory over empirical work and text-based humanities over historical investigations. Moreover, whiteness often functioned as the implicit norm in these primarily theoretical projects. Happily, however, emerging scholars such as Dr. Garriga Lopez are shifting the field in important and original ways. Indeed, her work is an exemplar of this new wave of scholarship, putting marginalized voices at its forefront and decentering the questions and frameworks that have driven the scholarship, focused as it has been on the US and Europe. So the talk today, I want to just point out, is co-sponsored by the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities, the Department of History, and the Department of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies. So won't you please join me in welcoming Dr. Garriga Lopez.
Thank you all very much. Good morning. I guess I would like to start by acknowledging that we are on Lenape land and to give gratitude for being able to be here on this land. Also, my thanks to Paisley Curra for the invitation to be here, and to the Department of Women and Gender Studies, to the Ethel Wolf Institute and the History Department, and a big shout out to the Puerto Rican Studies and Latino Studies Department. And thank you to you all for being here today. It is really an honor for me to be able to present my work. So I heard through the grapevine that you all got advance notes on my presentation. So I will, give some of that brief overview of transfeminism as it emerges from the 1980s to the present, and then do a kind of retroactive look at the decriminalization of homosexuality in Ecuador as an example of transfeminism before it had a name, right? So that's the basis of my presentation for today. And to begin, I'll just say that transfeminism is a form of intersectional feminism founded on the understanding that sexism and transphobia are interlocking and mutually reinforcing systems of oppression. It applies feminist analyses and methods towards the advancement of trans liberation and empowerment. And in the 21st century, transfeminism really took hold as a transnational social movement through a network that combines political activism, scholarship, artistic expression, and radical sex subcultures, which I hope to tell you a little bit more about today. These networks were established and strengthened through several feminist conferences and activist conferences on the internet and through other forms of digital media, and within the circuits of migration and travel to and from Europe and the Americas. So the term transfeminism, or transfeminismo in Spanish, was first articulated in Spain in one of these conferences. They didn't have particularly creative names for their conference, so it was called Feminist Conference. But it was in that period that they first started to articulate the need to include trans women in conversations about feminism. Since those early years, transfeminism has become part of a much broader subculture within Spain that is anti-capitalist, fighting against austerity measures on the part of the government, committed to anti-racist, post-colonial, and pro-migrant critiques of state policies, and has a kind of anti-institutional or leaderless approach, similar to what we saw in the Occupy Wall Street movement here in the US, where rather than kind of there being one clear political agenda, there's this kind of multiplicity of voices and different participants that nobody is one particular leader. Susan Stryker and Talia Betcher's introduction to transfeminism, it's a special double issue of the TSQ, documents how in the United States, transfeminism was coined by Diana Curvant and Emi Koyama in 1992 in the context of their intersectional work on trans, intersex, disability, and survivorship of sexual violence. One of my recurring points throughout this presentation will be that women of color feminisms are central to the rise of transfeminism, and so I'll take a moment here to point out that Emi Koyama is Japanese American. And she published her Transfeminist Manifesto online in 2001. That circulated enormously throughout Latin America and various other places. And in it, she described transfeminism as a movement by and for trans women who view their liberation to be intrinsically linked to the liberation of all women and beyond. Susan Stryker and Talia Betcher note that transfeminism in the United States is often associated, Paisley Corral also talks about this quite a bit, with a kind of third wave of feminist critique or politics that embraces a kind of sex radical, sex positive approach that supports the decriminalization of sex work and sex worker empowerment, and that kind of takes a more decentralized approach to questions of identity. And also a different relationship to kind of marginalized body types, right? And here perhaps we're speaking more specifically about racialized bodies, trans bodies, kind of the FAT movement being a part of transfeminism within also a performance and what they call a post-porno, which is basically when you kind of appropriate and subvert the medium of pornography so as to kind of push back against the overwhelming force of the kind of hegemonic pornography that is so influential to people's day-to-day experience of their sexuality. But I mean, I think beyond that kind of a very straightforward position on what is post-porno, I think that post-porno is the development of a sexual subculture very closely tied to performance art, very closely tied to the kind of squatter movement, polyamorous love, and various other kinds of non-normative expressions of gender and sexuality. So that would be a kind of brief definition of post-porno, and because of the connection between Spain and Latin America, the travel, the digital connections, the kind of circuits of travel to these conferences, post-porno is very much a feature of transfeminism throughout Latin America as well. Transfeminism often develops in close relation to advocacy for sex worker decriminalization and empowerment on account of the widespread labor discrimination that often pigeonholes trans women into sex work. As Rajeswari Sundararajan notes in the context of India, the criminalization of these economic activities brings sex workers into an immediate, constant, and pressing proximity to the police and other state institutions. In Ecuador, transfeminism first emerged in 2002 as a grassroots resistance to police abuse against trans sex workers. This was known as the Patrulla Legal. It was formed by a group of law students, specifically Elizabeth Vasquez, who on her way home from night classes would routinely pass by a group of trans sex workers, and one day very literally decided to kind of cross the parallel line between herself and the existence of these trans sex workers and engage them in a kind of grassroots political education that was mutual and reciprocal, and that led to the formation of these troops that would travel throughout the night and kind of mediate conflicts with the police who were prone to arbitrary arrests as well as abuse on the street, extortion, and document these abuses, try and mediate them on the spot, and kind of work towards establishing a safer working environment for trans sex workers and other sex workers as well. There was a large effort to build coalition with sex worker organizations that were already in place, like Boquitas Rojas, for example. The direct engagement with the police and the legal system was kind of grounded in the experience of these trans sex workers, kind of provided the environment in which a particular set of explicitly transfeminist activist strategies flourished. So my broader research project offers a kind of recuperative history of transfeminist activism over the past 2 decades with a specific focus on the work of trans sex workers to kind of combat police violence through the use of interpersonal and community-based mediation, cultural and aesthetic production, and legal subversion. So in that first period of 2002 to 2012, many of their actions were kind of geared towards stopping police abuse. And as they were able to gain a little more communication with these street level police officers as well as their commanders, it actually turned into a series of workshops that were conducted with the Quito police on how to interact respectfully with trans people, and as well including guidelines within the police handbook to kind of call people by their names that they give as opposed to the names that are listed on their IDs, and by the gender pronouns that they give instead of what's listed on their IDs. And of course this is all complicated, right? Because it's not about making it easier or more correct for the police to harass sex workers, but it certainly did have an impact in the immediate moment to reduce the level of police harassment. And I think that even though that was kind of a policy level or a reform level approach where transfeminism attempts to be a very interpersonal and anti-institutional approach, I will say that the main tactic that they engaged with was conversing with the lowest level police officers and understanding that they in and of themselves act as a kind of first guard of the law, and that they can be reasoned with in a way, and that they are also part of the street scene. So even though it was a kind of institutional approach, it was one established through a kind of interpersonal mediation. So that was really recurring within the work of the Patrulla Legal. So one of the first organizing efforts of transfeminist activism in Spain was a call to eliminate transgender and gender dysphoria as a diagnostic category within the field of psychiatry, specifically that DMS book. So the campaign to depathologize trans identities, which started in 2006, was the impetus for formation of a larger network of activist organizations across different countries. And the rejection of psychiatry as an institution where trans people are pathologized led to a kind of broader rejection of party politics and rights discourse as a source for empowerment. So as a result, it's not unique to Ecuador, right? Transfeminism often strategizes within a kind of micro-political framework that prioritizes grassroots activism and cultural and aesthetics practices, as well as interpersonal and community mediation over and above government interventions and legal reforms. Moreover, this demand for kind of gender self-determination led to a kind of parallel call for the kind of absolute rejection of surgical interventions that are often imposed on intersex children. So not only was it about kind of access to hormones and surgical interventions for trans and gender non-conforming people, but the call for gender self-determination was also a call against interventions on intersex children. Transfeminism congealed as a transnational social movement beginning in 2009, again with this Conferencia Feminista, Transfeminist Conference. And during this conference, the attendees drafted the Manifesto for Transfeminist Insurrection, which was read aloud at the end of the conference and also published simultaneously on January 1st of 2010 on a wide range of different online platforms. If you look for it today, you will probably still find it on the Cuban government's website, because Fidel Castro's daughter has been a very strong proponent of transgender rights within her country. This manifesto represented the formalization of principles that came into being as an integral part of the Spanish political subculture of post-porn and anti-capitalism. Lucia Egaña and Miriam Solá describe how following this pivotal conference, there was a kind of, the stage was set for a wide range of subversive activist projects. They say, little by little, transfeminism has woven a network between groups within and beyond Catalonia, working through such questions as pornography and sex work, trans depathologization, squatting, migrant resistance, economic precarity, the critique of state feminism, the institutionalization of the LGBT movement, open source software, copyleft, Creative Commons licensing, anti-surveillance and data obfuscation strategies, self-training and peer-to-peer education that allows for more access to technology for more kinds of people who have been excluded from it, and performance and the body, end quote. In this respect, transfeminism encompasses much more than the inclusion of trans people within feminist politics or their depathologization in the field of psychiatry. It is an epistemology, a theory of knowledge and power that guides a diverse array of transfeminist activist political practices. Sayak Valencia, a Mexican transfeminist scholar and activist, identifies 4 central lines within transfeminism as a kind of global network. And the first she lists is women of color feminism, then post-pornographic and anti-capitalist subcultures from Spain, the global movement to end the pathologization of trans and intersex people, and a sustained commitment to the empowerment of migrants and people living in conditions of poverty or social marginalization. This last connection is less obvious but highly significant because migration is a recurring feature within the lived experience of sex workers. As Laura Agustin's research demonstrates, feminist debates regarding the criminalization versus legalization of sex work are often kind of lacking an understanding of how migration policy is a systemic source of disenfranchisement for sex workers that makes this question of legalization sort of beside the point. Let's see. These different points of inflection within transfeminism each speak to the material conditions of trans people's lives and their means of daily survival as migrants and sex workers, as ethnic and racial minorities in their home and host countries, and as people whose marginalization within capitalist economies leads them to form micro-political networks of mutual support and empowerment and self-directed action, or autogestión, as it's known in Spanish. So this developmental arc, right, from transfeminism as a politics that's kind of focused really solely on trans inclusion within feminism, to transfeminism as a kind of epistemological lens that organizes around a much broader range of political issues, is what Aren Aizura refers to as a turn to move the prefix trans in a kind of anti-identitarian direction that is still very much grounded in people's embodied and lived and material realities without kind of centering any one identity over another. And let's see, maybe we can move on to a slide. Another way to conceptualize this expansion of transfeminist praxis beyond trans identity is to attend to what Stryker and Betcher call the tremendous worldwide effect of intersectional feminisms promulgated by US feminists of color in the 1980s. So here I want to point out something that Chela Sandoval pointed out already in the 1990s, so I won't pretend to be original in saying this. But if you look at the titles of the work by women of color authors from the 1980s, you'll see recurringly, right, this bridge called My Back, Sister Outsider, Borderlands La Fronteras, All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave. Women of color exist in the interstices of the kind of hegemonic categories of people of color or of woman, right? And from this kind of early stages had been really rejecting the binary of woman and man as enough to account for their experiences, given their race, class, ethnic status, and therefore understood that there had to be at least a third gender to account for the lives of women of color. And I often think of Gloria Anzaldua's quote, this is my home, this thin edge of barbed wire, as that kind of slash mark between man and woman. And furthermore, she writes in La Frontera, Borderlands La Frontera, about how what feels oppressive to her is not the existence of male or female or masculine or feminine genders, but the kind of obligation to have to choose one or the other. So I really want to point again to even as far back as somebody like Polly Murray in the 1940s to say that people of color, women of color feminists have been central to a kind of intersectional feminism that includes trans people and has a very broad and capacious vision. And so one of the things that I argue repeatedly is that even though I'm giving you this kind of chronological order of here's where transfeminism started, and here's the next place where it was said, and here's where some publications are about it, in reality, transfeminism is kind of like a naturally occurring phenomenon, right? Wherever trans people see feminism as a useful analytic and political tool for liberation, that's transfeminism. Where we have seen the history of trans people be in the leadership of feminist, queer, and LGBT movements, that's transfeminism. So we're giving it a name now, but it's something that has existed for much longer. And I guess from there, I would like to just begin this kind of retroactive look to the work of Coccinelli, which was an organization that formed in 1997 as a result of a scandal that happened when a police raid occurred in a kind of rich and well-to-do neighborhood that was having a trans kind of beauty contest. And so I think they were perhaps used to raiding, extorting trans people, but kind of messed with the wrong group. And it became a national scandal, and suddenly something that people were unaware of, including and many times the police, was that there was actually in existence a penal code from way back in 1905 that criminalized homosexuality with jail time of up to 4 to 8 years. So when the police were routinely harassing people, they were not using this law, right? They were already used to being able to brutalize queer and trans people on the street without needing some formal law. But this law kind of came into light, and this group of trans sex workers that chose the name Coccinelli decided to begin to organize to try and kind of repeal that law. And what they chose to do was to petition the Constitutional Court to say that this penal law was unconstitutional, And in order to do that, they needed to collect 600 signatures, but they set out to collect 1,000 because they anticipated that the government would try to discount many of the signatures. So these signatures were not just like, hey, sign here, right? People had to hand over their state ID. Their state ID had to be photocopied and taken alongside with the signature. And much to the dismay of the Cochinelli members, many of the kind of nascent underground lesbian and gay organizations that were around did not want to participate in collecting signatures and did not so much as want to sign the petition themselves for fear that it would lead to them being outed. And instead wanted to kind of engage in, this was the first time that Alexis Ponce, the lawyer who carried this constitutional demand, said it was the first time he had heard the word lobbying, because the gay and lesbian groups were saying, no, we should lobby and instead push forward a kind of national legislation, which would of course been a much longer process and subject to the kinds of whims of the different political parties. So they decided to pursue this strategy of collecting signatures, and they had a very bold tactic, which was to stand on street corners and say, hey, you, sign this, right? And I interviewed Estela Estreves, and she told me that at that time there wasn't really enough time on the street to say, this is Article 516, this is how we're harassed by the police, this is what it means to be gay or to be trans. Instead, they would say our rights were violated. And given that the police were in a position of extorting the population as a whole, right, their claims of police abuse went unquestioned, and people were willing to sign those documents. So this photo that we have here is of the members of Cochinelli attending a weekly vigil of the Restrepo brothers. The Restrepo brothers were two teenage boys who were kidnapped and murdered by the police. Their family were Colombian, and there's some suspicion that them being kind of not from Ecuador had something to do with their murder. But the reality is that they were kind of at the wrong place at the wrong time, right? They were without their parents driving their car, and whatever happened, these boys were never found. And their parents were so deeply distraught by the disappearance of their children that they absolutely refused the kind of usual dismissal of, political dissidents or criminality that are usually attributed to people who are disappeared by the police. That kind of, well, they must have been doing something, right? Well, these boys were too well loved, too well adjusted, too well known for that to really fly. And the parents, more than anything, dedicated the rest of their lives to seeking out justice for their kids. So the members of Cochinelli attended many of these weekly vigils. And here we see that the caption of this photo, this is from a newspaper clipping in 1997, says that this was the first kind of queer or trans march, gay march that happened in Ecuador. And even though there was only 20 people who actually marched down the street, they were able to collect 300 signatures that night. And it's because the march ended at the plaza where the family held its weekly vigil, and the people who attended those weekly vigils had seen them around enough, right, to have a sense of solidarity and kind of collective movement with these trans sex workers who were also being very deeply brutalized by the police. So that was a really big turning point for them. And also importantly, Alexis Ponce, who was the person who brought forth that lawsuit to the Constitutional Court, was also a representative for the family members of the Restrepo brothers. So Ecuador being a small place, there's a lot of kind of overlap about who does the environmental work, who does the queer justice work, who does all this kind of different stuff. I really wanted to share this image with all of y'all because I think that for me, this was one of the most beautiful findings in my kind of archival research. Here, I think we see what Ntozake Shange calls a laying on of hands, right? The kind of almost unbroken chain of contact between people who are sitting on each other's laps, holding each other's hands, arms around each other, and that this meeting is being held in a beauty parlor, right? So rather than thinking of beauty parlors as spaces that reinforce sexist stereotypes or aesthetics about women, instead understanding beauty parlors were also some of the few spaces available for employment for queer and trans women, and that in those spaces they were able to organize, that those were spaces where their beauty was celebrated as opposed to shunned, and that in these kinds of, this is actually how they would dress to go to protests as well, right? So Estrella Esteves noted that wherever she went, she was in a miniskirt and heels, and his name is Alfredo Cabral, notes in his memoirs, right, that they would come out in bikini tops to different protests and stuff like that, so that lipstick and signs of femininity became also signs of protest and resistance in ways that I think were really important to kind of note. Let's see, what else can I say to you about this? So, these varied examples make evident that transfeminism does not conform to a single ideology or practice. Instead, its political dynamism lies in its function as a contingent and context-specific epistemology. It is both transnational and micropolitical, intimately tied to specific material needs of trans people, and also capacious enough to include broader struggles for social justice. Consistent with the Latin origin of the word trans, which means to cross, transfeminism can be thought of as a feminism in motion, a movement that is continually transforming margins into centers, if we can use Bell Hooks' imagery. So this is the global context in which transfeminism takes hold as a mode of politics. But I would like to reinstate that even though there's this mode of politics that is formal, then there's also the kind of naturally occurring acts of solidarity and kind of productive uses of feminism. Yeah, I feel like those were some of the last things I wanted to share with you. There is, her name is Paulina Gonzalez, and I guess what I would say about her is if you see how this image is organized, right? This is a very kind of joyful moment. There's a lot of smiles. There's some desire going on, right? There's not a lot of tension. This is right here, the presidential palace. This is not a space of sex work, but this is a space of protest. This is where the weekly vigils were held. And I guess I want to say that when these trans sex workers realized that the lesbian and gay organizations would not help to collect signatures and would not sign the signatures themselves, they decided very consciously to kind of reach out for support from straight men, right? From the very straight men who desired them, who were drawn to them, who they interacted with freely on the street, on different streets, but perhaps very similar kinds of flirtatious interactions. So again, the willingness to kind of mobilize sexuality and seduction towards empowerment as opposed to a more rigid conception of how you do consciousness raising, and also kind of that kind of guerrilla warfare of, you know, getting what you need by any means necessary, as opposed to waiting for these broader legislative processes to offer up freedom. And I can certainly say that when I did my research on the gender ID law that was passed in January of 2016, I can tell you that when it was initially proposed, there was a vision for a gender for all, right? A sense that we, each of us, would select our gender identity that would be shown on our IDs. And by the time it was done kind of going through that legislative process of debate, it was an ID that required 2 witnesses to testify to your gender identity, created a new separate ID for transgender people, and also kind of listed them not as kind of masculine or feminine, but maintained the category of sex within the ID, right? And turned it not into M or F as it used to be, but hombre or mujer, so like really spelling out this gender category as a biological term in a way that felt very bittersweet for the activists who were working towards this since the summer of 2012. So I really see that contrast, right, in terms of the ways in which trying to incorporate oneself into the formal legal strategies of achieving formal rights can really be challenging and an energy drain, and perhaps one of the great things of transfeminism is to see all the various aspects of legal subversion strategies that they have engaged in. Thank you so much.
So we have time for questions, and I know especially my class is prepared, but they better be. But questions, and you can just choose the.
Okay, yes.
I really like the part that you presented about like using sexuality to like get what you need. Is there like more information about, like, do we know how many like straight men signed the documents? Like, you know, because like in this picture you can tell there's a lot of like, and they're like looking at her, like they're very interested in her in a sexual way. But do we know like the numbers behind that?
You know, I don't. Those are the kinds of documents that go into the court and don't come back. And I haven't had a chance to kind of access Alexis Ponce's legal records. What I will say is that I have access to Gonzalo Abarca's extensive photographic record, and that this was one of various photos that I have, especially newspaper clippings, that show trans women kind of surrounded by straight men who are smiling right into the camera and signing the document in support of the decriminalization of homosexuality. Thank you for that question. Anybody else?
You can have lots of pauses here.
Sure.
Hi, I was wondering, since 2016, has there been any improvement with the IDs? And has it benefited in any way, given the...
You know, I feel that in some way it has encouraged more people to get an ID. In another way, before this ID law was passed, it was already possible for you to change your name according to your gender identity. And now when you change your gender, you have to change your name, and if you change your name, you have to change your gender. So I think depending on who you ask, people will tell you, yes, you know, before, even though you could change your name, there wasn't an official policy that said so. Therefore, it was always kind of hit or miss in terms of whether the lawyer could really argue it. There is a difference between needing to get a lawyer to be able to change your name versus it being an administrative process that has some restrictions to it, but is nevertheless available to people who don't have the income to purchase a private lawyer. So I would say it's been a really mixed bag in that regard.
Thank you.
Yes, another question.
Yeah, I was wondering, so in like working off that question about the IDs, I know that, for example, in California, even if you're not changing your gender but you're trying to change your name, the ID laws like require that you have like proof from other people, like similar to what you were just describing, where like you need like 2 witnesses to say that yes, this is your gender, this is your name. And so like, do you see these similarities in some of the United States like ID laws? Because like even for people that are not changing their names for gender, for reasons regarding their gender, like it's still, there's this interesting like want to like not let people express themselves how they feel they'd like to.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is part of the transfeminist critique, right? Is why are we listing gender or sex on IDs, these are categories of social control and categorization that make us easier to pinpoint and measure, but that don't actually give some specific benefit to us, right? And it's very much being required to fit into one or another. There are trends within activism, especially within legal activism. So yeah, absolutely, people realize that there's this thing called administrative violence, and if your gender doesn't match the things that are in your identification documents, then this limits your access to housing, healthcare, education, employment, all these things that matter, right? And at the same time as they are doing that, they're incorporating themselves into the logics of respectability politics that say we are citizens, we are workers, we are students, we are respectable people that demand to kind of be acknowledged within society. And so as trans becomes more normalized, it also becomes more normalizing. And we see that in terms of these very specific restrictions around what you need to prove in order to be considered trans, and also a kind of rejection of the gender non-binary or kind of in-between positions, right? Where I think that there's recent conversation, especially by Cole Risky, for example, who kind of points out that where trans attempts to be this universal category that encompasses any racial, class, ethnic, cultural, whatever background, to really center our focus in Latin America and the Caribbean on the figure of travesti, which is of course not all-encompassing of all trans people, right? But is an example of an identity that is very geographically specific, that is very much racialized as Black, that is connected to sex work in explicit ways, and perhaps most importantly for the purpose of this question, that explicitly refuses to kind of take on the, yes, I am a woman, in order to have a political voice, in order to be represented and active within the kind of daily politics of the country or of any place. Yes?
So in one of the classes I'm taking for pros, we're exploring Chicana testimonios, and we're exploring like criticisms of advocacy for sex work within feminism, because some feminists argue that advocating for sex work is counterproductive because you're advocating for something that is oppressive towards women. I disagree with that, but I wanted to know, like, from a trans feminist perspective, how do you defend yourself from that criticism of like, oh, you're advocating for something that harms you?
Sure. Thank you very much for that question. And it's certainly a very complicated question, because within the sex work industry, we do see an enormous amount of violence against sex workers and exploitation of them as laborers, right? I think that the trans feminist perspective simply says that we have seen over and over again how criminalization only worsens these conditions, only makes their poverty deeper, their exploitation greater, and that when we look towards decriminalization, not even necessarily legalization, which kind of leads to this all codification, we see that there are self-organized networks of support. There's like a website on called Pineapple that is self-organized sex workers providing each other with mental health services. They manage to get funding from Pornhub and all those companies that owe them, right? And do that on their own. So that when we decriminalize, we actually make space for their self-organized practices of empowerment. I guess I want to turn your question a little bit to the question of migration, because certainly there's a camp that says, you know, all sex work, all pornography is violence against women. It's irredeemable and irrecuperable, and it's based in that kind of extensive history of exploitation that they see a solution to in the abolition and criminalization of sex work, right? On the other hand, we have a kind of camp that says, in order to address those aspects that are exploitative, we need to kind of bring it out from the underground and make it so that we can talk about these things openly without risk of being stigmatized, arrested, what have you. Laura Agustin says you're both missing the point, right? The great majority of sex workers are migrants, right? At least in the European context that she's talking about. And if you are a migrant, if you are undocumented, then you do not have the right to work, period, right? So decriminalization will perhaps help to limit the ways in which you are targeted, but legalization will not necessarily increase the likelihood that you are no longer targeted by state agents, right? And so I like to say, you know, if what you want is to abolish sex work, then here's some testimonies of people who say, well, I was working at a restaurant and then there was an ICE raid and now I'm doing this, right? And if you want to work towards the decriminalization of sex workers in an effective way, then you actually need to look to migration policy as that systemic source of disenfranchisement for sex workers. So I really appreciate her perspective because she kind of takes us away from this debate about whether it's always oppressors or whether there's some way it can be empowering or what the context is, to kind of say, here's the lived reality of sex workers and how can we address those conditions in order to improve their quality of lives according to their terms, you know? Thank you for that question. Yes?
I was wondering, if we think of that image, the words or the label came up, the desire within straight men. Why using straight men? Why not saying the desire within queer men? Is there something about that move that you're doing?
Sure. I appreciate that question. I feel like I read these men as straight men, and I think that we could talk about them as part of the queer community. And I think that oftentimes there is a great stigma against men who partner or have romantic or sexual relations with trans women, and that it's important for us to be welcoming of those men into the queer community. So I appreciate your question, and I would say that I admit that I did not put too much thought into calling them straight versus queer, except to say that they live their lives as straight men. They are not necessarily carrying around a gay flag, and they were explicitly not the people who were organizing around that identity. Instead, they were men who were responding to their desire for women as their kind of primary impetus to approach them. Yes.
I'm sorry, I asked
You're on
about
fire. Come on.
talking about La Frontera, like in that book, there's a lot about what it's like to be on the border and how, you know, you cross the barbed wire fence and all of a sudden, like, you can't speak the language, you don't understand, like, the people and the culture is different and everything. And so I was thinking, like, about that, and then, for example, like in a trans lens, I think it's really interesting in that, you know, it's kind of like once you cross this barrier of like people looking like marginalizing you because you're trans, you are able to get things done, like in this picture where it's like they're not thinking about if she's trans or not, they're thinking about like she's a woman and they desire her, and they're still able to like you know, like cross that barbed wire fence where it's like sometimes straight men can be very like violent towards trans women. They're able to cross that barbed wire fence to like affect change and to like get what they need done. And so I think it's very interesting, like with this photo and this story of how like being able to approach straight men in a way that's like, on one hand it could be very violent, but then on the other hand there could be like a payoff.
Yeah.
I think it's just very interesting.
And how much they're already accustomed to that, you know, as trans sex workers, street sex workers, they're already accustomed to that. This could mean, you know, a big payoff, or it could mean great danger. And I will say that they were subject to increased police harassment during the time that they were collecting these signatures. And they actually held what they labeled as the world's shortest press conference, where they kind of called in the national media and essentially announced that if one more of their members was disappeared or tortured in jail, they were going to release lists of all of the police chiefs and members who were their clients. So, you know, they were in fact taking on great personal risk in order to do this. And what you said just brought me back to your question, right? They were mobilizing straight privilege, right? Gay people were too afraid, reasonably, right, of persecution to really sign on to this kind of public document. But straight men did not have a sense that their identity would somehow be outed as queer from having signed this document, right? And I want to also remind us of the work that they did to build solidarity with the families of the Restrepo brothers and other people who were disappeared, as to say they weren't only mobilizing their sexuality, right? But they were really thinking outside of the box in terms of how to collect the signatures that they needed. And I really appreciate you bringing us back to the work of Gloria Anzaldúa and other authors of color, that absolutely they were managing many in-between spaces, right? In between language, geography, gender, culture, and really kind of, I think, articulating the politics of intersectionality before we had a word for it, articulating transfeminism before we had the term to describe it that way. But certainly we, instead of viewing transfeminism as something that emerges out of a European and North American white context, we understand that actually there is great continuity between the work of women of color feminists and transfeminism today, that we need not accept the kinds of racist stereotypes that position people of color as somehow more transphobic or more homophobic than any other community. And at the same time recognize that transfeminism is one component of feminism, and there's also the trans-exclusionary radical feminists, and then there's a whole range of other feminists who are not defined within this debate, right? Who cannot adequately be said to not engage in transphobia just because they're not, externally saying things that are exclusionary of trans people. So to understand that there's kind of many other layers of feminism that have yet to really engage this topic of transfeminism, and that it's kind of a perennial conflict that emerges, but that I think we're much better positioned in this third wave to respond to. Yes?
Thank you. This was so wonderful. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Along those lines, actually, one of the things I really, from what I know of third wave feminism that I really like, is that insistence, especially in sort of feminists of color, of bringing your community with you, right? It's sort of that effort to sort of work within your communities, not reject that, but to sort of say, I want my community to change and accept me, right? And I'm wondering, in this particular context, what kinship networks did you see activated? So in terms of the organization, right? Did they work with their family networks? Did they work within those particular, networks to mobilize support? Or what is their, I guess basically, what is their relationships with their sort of birth families? What is sort of, and was that a resource, or was that something that they weren't able to draw on?
Thank you so much for that question. So it's not in either of the texts that many of you read for today, but there's a different section of my book manuscript that talks about a documentary film called Angel, that focuses on precisely a former member of Cochinelli who used to fist fight in the street with the police and moved to Europe, right, so that she could make more money and could support her family, right? So what we see is her finally obtaining her visa in Paris and coming back to Guayaquil to kind of check in on all of her family members whom she has been supporting for the past 4 years. And we see a very complex relationship to her gender identity. She, for example, put her brother through police school. So he's a police officer, and she supported him and his family for a whole year in order for him to be able to cover that. So again, kind of refusing that distinction between trans women and the police, and understanding that they are part of the same communities in significant ways. but also kind of being expected to maintain the family on the basis of not being a father and head of the household, and therefore kind of experiencing a sense of being taken advantage of by their family members in a way that's not unfamiliar to people who send money back home, but a kind of feeling that they were unable to kind of move out of the extensive poverty that they lived in. And I guess I would say what I noticed about that was that precisely Angel's transition is what enabled her to move, enabled her to raise an enormous amount of money. And when you look at her brothers, one is a police officer, which is about one of the best jobs that you can get if you are low income, low skill, and the other one's just unemployed, right? And so you see the kind of lack of upward mobility and the ghettoization of Black people in these specific communities in Ecuador, that for some reason or other it's precisely her gender difference that enables a kind of exit from that space that she nevertheless returns to and stays very connected to, despite kind of ending the film with this sense that she can't really come back until she's done kind of building her home and able to come back here and kind of come back to Ecuador and retire. But also seeing her sisters move with her to Paris and them also engaging in practices of sex work and illicit economies. So again, refusing those distinctions of like trans women sex workers, when in reality many migrants engage in sex work as a way of kind of stepping stone and as a way of having a concrete way of paying back significant debts that are incurred during the migration process and all of those things. So I hope that that kind of vaguely answers your question in terms of it's very, they are very close relationships, but they're also very strained and not necessarily something that you could just categorize as supportive. What I will say is that her family was completely not scandalized by her sex work, right? And completely like understanding that this was a viable practice of economic survival for herself and for her whole family. So that felt like a moment of saying, yeah, maybe it's not about having, anybody speak directly into the camera and say, yes, I support my trans sister, but it was about a kind of day-to-day, unbothered and unscandalized acceptance of her. Thank you. One last question?
Yes. So I know that like with trans women, they weren't able to call upon the gay community to help them get the signatures.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if they were able to call upon like trans men to help them.
Thank you so much for bringing up trans men, right? So often they're left out of the conversation. Giovanni Jaramillo was a member of one of the lesbian and gay organizations that was organizing to decriminalize homosexuality through lobbying efforts. He and others have insisted that those combined efforts were really what led to the change, because that lobbying was in fact kind of changing political perceptions. But what I would say to speak to your question is that trans men really enter the scene of transfeminism in Ecuador in 2002 with the formation of the Legal Patrol, where Elizabeth Vasquez, in the second iteration of the patrol in 2003, made a very conscious effort to reach out to trans men and incorporate them as paralegal kind of community mediators of conflicts with the police. So that's where they really come into prominence as visible members of LGBT and queer activist spaces, but that's also where we saw much more community building among trans women and trans men. So both romantic and kind of personal relationships, but also long-term activist coalitional work between trans men and trans women, and increasingly the organization of trans men's groups on their own, kind of cultural dance groups and putting on different performances throughout the year. So that's the kind of way in which trans men fit into the story of transfeminism in Ecuador. In the context of many other Latin American countries and Spain, of course, trans men have been longtime participants within feminist movements. And so despite the kind of different tensions that might kind of bring about, I think that when transfeminism has really emerged, they've found a place for themselves there as well.
All right, well, can we have a round of applause? Wait. You can't ignore the chair of Puerto Rican Latino Studies, please. Of course, yes.
Well, we know that there is this the stereotype of machismo and marianismo, equated sort of with Latin America. We know that that's not true. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
But can you sort of just speak to those cultural gender role expectations, particularly because Ecuador, smack in the middle of Latin America, part of it, the cultural pushback. I mean, you're saying that they got straight men, or apparently sort of straight men to sign off, but I'm assuming that they had many challenges, and that these people were very brave to actually walk up to someone and say, "Hey, give me your photo ID, give me your signature," because while some might not have cared because they were straight men, some would definitely never do that because they were straight men. So
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. Ecuador is a predominantly Catholic country. It is a country where sexism and homophobia are the norm above kind of gender and sexual liberation politics. I will say though that they had the wave of public sentiment on their side, because people were increasingly feeling that the dictatorship had not ended, and that the police were out of control in their extortion of the population and in their brutalization of people on the street and in other spaces. So I think that rather than attributing a kind of shift in gender and sexual perceptions within broader Ecuadorian society, there was a sense that police couldn't keep doing this. And there was also, I believe, an understanding that this was part of a broader global trend, right? And this is something that Ecuador and other countries struggle with quite a bit, in terms of, this is what they're doing in the north, this is what they're doing in Europe, this is what they say is the advances in social rights and human rights, and so then we should probably do this, right? And soon after the Constitutional Court decided in 1997 that it was unconstitutional, Article 516, the following year they included homosexuality, sexual orientation, as a protected category within the non-discrimination clauses of the Constitution. So I think that there was a way in which the law was a little bit ahead of the culture and pushing cultural shifts that kind of took hold later on. Thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. All right, thank you very much for coming. And the last talk in our Transfeminism series will be, I think it's going to be April 21st with Susan Stryker. Anybody who didn't sign in for my class, sign the attendance. All right, thank you.